About the year 330 AD, the Roman emperor at the time, Constantine, along with the help of his mother, St. Helena, went to Jerusalem in order to build a church over the site of the Lord's crucifixion and death, a little hill known as Golgotha or Calvary. And as the excavations for the church began, they discovered 3 crosses. They unearthed 3 crosses. And so they concluded these must be the crosses of the Lord and the 2 thieves that were crucified with him. But they couldn't tell which one was which, obviously. They all looked the same. The sign that had been on top of the Lord's cross was separated from the crosses, and so they couldn't tell which one was which. So, the story has it that they sent for a woman who was close to death, and they had her come and touch the first cross, and nothing happened. She touched the second cross, and nothing happened. She touched the third cross, and was instantly healed. And so they concluded this must be the cross of the Lord. So they gathered up the pieces of the wood, and they put them in a fancy box called a reliquary. And as the church was built, they enshrined the pieces of the true cross in the church so that the faithful could venerate them, could come there and pray before them. So for about 300 years, this is what happened in Jerusalem. People would come to the church now known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Holy Tomb, and they could venerate there the relics of the true cross for about 300 years. Somewhere near the year 630, about 300 years later, the Persian king, whose name was Khosroes, attacked Jerusalem, destroyed about 300 churches with his army, and stole all the stuff from the churches, including the relics of the true cross, and took them away. So now the emperor at the time, 300 years after Constantine and his mother Helena, his name was Heraclius. The emperor Heraclius was angered by this act, obviously, and so he took his army and went after the Persian king Khosroes, captured them, defeated the army, and took back the relics of the cross. And in order to bring them back into the city of Jerusalem and restore them to their rightful place, he organized a big procession. And as he was processing with the relics of the true cross in their box, their reliquary on his shoulder, as he got to the gate of the city, he was suddenly struck unable to walk. And his servant that was accompanying him said to him, "Majesty, you know when the Lord carried the cross through the streets of Jerusalem, he was wearing a crown of thorns. You are wearing a fancy golden crown." Secondly, he said, "Majesty, when the Lord carried the cross through the streets of Jerusalem, he was dressed in rags, if anything at all. You are dressed in fine purple and linen." And finally, he said, "Majesty, when the Lord carried the cross through the streets of Jerusalem, he was barefoot. You are wearing fine shoes." So the emperor Heraclius took off his golden crown, his fancy clothes, his fancy shoes, and put on simple clothing, no shoes, no crown, and he was now able to walk again. And so he carried the relics of the true cross back to their place in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was now being restored, and he lifted them up in order that all the people in the procession would be able to venerate them. Now the word lifted up comes from the Latin word for lifted up is exalt. And so, ever since that time, in about 630, there's been a feast every year called the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, the lifting up of the cross, so that the people could venerate the relics. Now, we might ask ourselves, why are the pieces of the true cross so important? What's so special about them? They're just some pieces of wood on which the Lord died. However, you may not have thought about the fact that as the Lord was hanging on that cross, he was bleeding profusely, and his blood soaked into the wood of that cross, thereby making the cross, his cross, a relic, something left behind by a saint. The word relic comes from a Latin word that means something left behind. That cross, that wood of that cross was made holy by the fact that the Lord's blood was soaked into it. And so from that point in 630, relics, little tiny slivers, splinters of the true cross, have been sent all over the world. They're enshrined in churches here and there. We're going to see if we can find one for our church. I'm going to put somebody to work on that very soon. And so in itself, the wood of the cross is a relic because the Lord's blood soaked into it. But from a symbolic point of view, the cross is also important for us, but not always do people understand why it's important as a symbol. We think about the fact, we see movies, we hear homilies about how much the Lord suffered for us, especially around, Good Friday time. Yes, the Lord suffered tremendously for us, but I'm going to suggest, for the sake of the argument, not to take anything away from his suffering, but the suffering is not what it's about. The cross does not symbolize Christ's suffering. It symbolizes his perfection. If you will, it symbolizes his obedience. In St. Paul's reading today, we heard St. Paul in this sort of hymn, the hymn about Christ and his obedience, that the Lord became obedient even unto death. The point is not how much he suffered. The point is how much he was obedient to the will of the Father. Remember that the Lord's life came to perfection or completion, we might say, at the agony in the garden. A few hours before the Lord hung on the cross and suffered and died, he suffered in the garden, if you remember, so much that he began to sweat blood. The anxiety was such that it was very stressful, obviously, because he knew what was coming. And if you remember, in his prayer he said, Father, if it be your will, let this cup of suffering pass from me. But not my will, but your will be done. In other words, at that point, the agony in the garden, the Lord's will, his human will, and the divine will of the Father became as one. He knew what he had to undergo, but once he said, Father, let me be obedient to you, your will, not mine be done, then whatever else came after that was, if you will, with all due respect, academic. It didn't matter what came after that, because he had decided, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be obedient to the Father's will, no matter what. So I would like to suggest to you, for your reflection, when you go away today, in the future, we'll come back to this theme on Good Friday, obviously. It's not about the suffering. It's not about, see how much he suffered for us. That's not it. When I was a kid, I remember, and even after I was a kid, for many years, I couldn't figure it out. Why does the suffering of one more innocent person make any difference? People suffer every day all over the world. Animals suffer every day all over the world. That doesn't change anything. The Lord's suffering, of course, because he was the Son of God and God, was offered for our salvation. That's true. I'm not taking anything away from that. I'm not talking about that today. I'm talking about the fact that for us, the key is obedience to the will of the Father. That's what the symbol of the cross represents for us. So when we look to the cross, we don't necessarily have to think about how much he suffered, but what does it take for us to be completely obedient to the will of the Father? That's the goal of our life, to become obedient even to the point of death if necessary. I'll close with this thought. Somebody said to me the other day, you know, Father, in my part of the world where I live, to be a Christian involves much persecution. Think about the people in Syria. Think about the people in Iraq and the other places in the Middle East where Christians are being persecuted and chased out. And so this person said to me, I have to keep my religion, my Christianity, my Catholicism private. I said, no, that's not what it's about. We can never do that. Did the Lord keep his Christianity, his Catholicism, his gospel private because he was being persecuted by the Jews? Of course not. He knew it was the Father's will to preach that truth and to live that truth, no matter what, even unto death. So this is the same thing for us. If we are to imitate Christ, we are to imitate him in every aspect, particularly, if you will, being obedient to the will of the Father, no matter what it costs us. So take that with you. Every time you look at the cross, it's not about the suffering, it's about the obedience. How am I being obedient to the Father's will completely or not?